Hi, this is Matt McCormick of the Department of Philosophy at California State University, Sacramento. This is a lecture on Eric Schwitzgebel and Mara Garza's article, A Defense of Artificial Intelligence Rights, for my Philosophy of Artificial Intelligence course. So Schwitzgebel and Garza have got a series of arguments here, most of them leading to the conclusion that we ought to give artificial intelligence systems moral status if they meet certain conditions. So what are those conditions? They've got this no relevant difference argument that says if some entity A deserves some particular degree of moral consideration and entity B does not deserve that same degree of moral consideration, then there must be some relevant difference between the two that grounds this difference in moral status. You can't justify or defend asymmetric treatment unless there's some principled grounds or difference between the two. And they maintain that there are possible artificial intelligence systems who do not differ in any such relevant respects from human beings. So what does that mean? Well, it's a wide open point they're making about possible artificial intelligence systems. So we're talking about 10, 30, 50, 100 years out. And the point is that classically on moral theories, like Kantian moral theories, there are properties that are morally salient. So for Kant, what's morally salient about your existence is that you're a rational, autonomous agent, or that you're a self-governing, rational, autonomous agent. For utilitarians, what matters is the fact that you can feel pleasure or pain. Some philosophers of a utilitarian bent have also pressed out to the point of arguing that it's sentience, the capacity to feel pleasure or pain, that qualifies a creature for moral consideration. And then Schwitzgebel and Garza consider some other options. But the idea is that eventually we're going to get to the stage where we're going to have artificial intelligence systems that in one regard or another possess these properties. So if it's in virtue of those properties that human beings deserve that moral status and moral treatment, then the AI systems are going to deserve it too. Therefore, there are possible AIs who deserve a degree of moral consideration similar to that of human beings. So this is kind of turning everything around. We've been worried all semester about what are the implications of building a super intelligent AI, and then maybe it's going to wipe all the humans out, right? So there'd be some moral disaster coming from their side. And what Schwitzgebel and Garza are pointing out is that under certain circumstances, if they have the right sorts of moral making properties, then they deserve moral treatment. They have properties in virtue of which we owe them obligations. Now, one way to think about this is that classically we talk about positive and negative rights. And those impose positive and negative obligations on others. So a positive right is when, in virtue of having that right, others around you are obligated to make some positive action and provide you with something. So we think of American citizens as having a right to an education, children, for example. So in that case, it's a positive right. We tax the citizenry, and then they pay for school. Even people who don't have kids, since kids are owed that positive right. The rest of us pay for their schooling so that they can be educated. But for other rights, we consider them as being negative rights. So, you've got a right to the pursuit of happiness, and that means I shouldn't interfere with you on that. Or if you've got a freedom of religion or any number of other rights, if they're negative rights, then I need to leave you alone and let you pursue it, but I don't have to make positive actions in order to provide it for you. So, Schwitzgebel and Garza don't go into the positive or negative distinction here, but it might help to think in the background about, primarily probably what they're thinking about here is that in virtue of us having these moral obligations, then there's certain things we should not do to them. So they treat them as negative rights. We shouldn't kill them. We shouldn't torture them. We shouldn't inflict senseless or pointless pain on them or something of that sort. A place for expansion here, or something to think about, is making the positive and negative right distinction, and then wondering whether and to what extent possible AI systems that have these properties might have might deserve some positive rights from the rest of us, impose a positive obligation from us to provide them with something more. Okay, so they propose, in order to support this argument, something they call the difference test. If you're going to regard one type of entity as deserving greater moral consideration than another, you ought to be able to point to a relevant difference between those entities that justifies that differential treatment. If you can't point to a relevant difference, or if the differences you can point to are idiosyncratic or non-essential or prejudicial, then those don't support the distinction. Inability to provide such a justification opens up one to suspicions of chauvinism or bias, which of course is how we've seen this in the sort of steady expansion of human rights over history. The difference test has general appeal in the fight against chauvinism and bias among human beings. Human egalitarianism obviously gains support from the idea that skin color doesn't matter, ancestry, place of birth, gender, sexual orientation, and wealth cannot properly ground differences in a person's moral status. So those are examples of things that are not morally relevant differences. They're differences, but they're ones that we can't defend on principled grounds. Of course, now where this leads in recent discussions with people like Peter Singer is the expansion to animals. Where, animal rights people or vegans or vegetarians have argued, well, look, how can you justify the difference between the way you're treating the family dog versus the way you're treating pigs? There's no morally relevant difference here between their intelligence, their autonomy, their capacity to feel pain or pleasure, and so on. Yet people feel like there's a moral distinction to be made there, and it's okay to treat pigs one way but not dogs the same way. And you might think of human history as a sort of steady expansion of the circle of inclusion. So, my picture doesn't represent it here, but there was a time when the rights as we thought of them, at least socially and politically, were just extended to propertied white males. And then as our political history unfolds, we've steadily expanded that circle to include poor and rich, white and non-white, men and women, people of any gender or sexual orientation. Or we've deemed all of those to be irrelevant, and we've refused in the expansion of the circle here to allow those to be legitimate grounds for prohibiting somebody from getting moral status. So Schwitzgebel and Garza are saying the same thing about AI systems, that if they can acquire or if they achieve whatever properties they may be, moral making properties, the capacity to feel pleasure or pain or rational autonomy or something of that sort, then in virtue of having that, then they deserve treatment too. The no relevant difference argument aims to extend this egalitarian approach to AI systems. So, by extension, or like a neighbor argument here, is to consider this point that the idea is that we can't justify being meat chauvinists here. There's no principled difference between being made out of organic matter or biology versus some other kind of substance, as long as you've got the right kinds of properties. Now, what are those properties? Well, Schwitzgebel and Garza argue that what body or what kind of architecture, how you're built, you have, or what you're made out of, should be irrelevant to your moral status. You just need a body and an architecture that sustains the relevant psychological and social properties, and only psychological and social properties are directly relevant to moral status, or so we propose. So they would maintain that what you're made of doesn't provide us with legitimate philosophical grounds for making a distinction here. So you might get some pushback, or we could imagine people making creationist or theist or biologicist or Aristotelian objections to this kind of position. Somebody might maintain that unless you're created by God, you don't have rights of this sort, or you might maintain that there's some kind of principal ground on which to separate, creatures made of biological creatures versus inorganic or artificial creatures. Or you might even have an Aristotelian argument. Here's maybe the best one of the batch, that you have to have a certain telos, or a certain origin, or certain causal history to lead to your existence, and that's how you acquire your moral status. But Schwitzgebel and Garza don't give any credence to any of those views, and I think that's right. It makes sense to me that really what matters is having these psychological or social properties, and in virtue of having those, you have moral status. What matters is how these things think, how they feel, and how they interact with the rest of us, and that seems to be the most broad, abstract, sensible criteria on which you could draw a line, a sharp boundary between who matters and who doesn't. Okay, so here's another argument. They call it the slippery slope argument for AI rights. Imagine substituting a small artificial component into an entity who has rights, like a human. If that component contributes identically to the entity's psychology, it does not affect relevant social relationships. It does not affect that entity's rights. The process in one could be iterated to transform a natural human being with rights into a wholly artificial being with the same rights. So we saw David Chalmers run the same kind of argument about replacing human consciousness, where he imagined replacing a neuron at a time with an artificial neuron that duplicates all of the functions and all of the performances of your biological neurons. So by the same extension, their idea is, okay, build a human out of some synthetic material, and Chalmers' argument then was that we would expect that system to be conscious, and their view is, same point, you build an artificial system or replace an existing system, a system that has rights in it, and replace its parts with perfectly functioning parts that sustain its psychological and social functions, then that thing's going to have moral rights by the very, very same kind of argument, of parallel argument. So the conclusion then is that, therefore, it's possible to create an artificial being with the same rights as those of a natural human being. And that's all they need to get the sort of stronger conclusion. So now there's several categories of objections that people might make. One from Searle that we know. We read Searle's Chinese room argument, where he seemed to argue something like artificial entities might necessarily lack consciousness. I don't know if I would have used necessarily in this sentence, but they do. But you recall the argument from the Chinese room that something's missing from the Chinese room, that in virtue of which it doesn't have consciousness or intentionality or something. It's kind of I hadn't sort of thought this through before, but Searle's got this example where in the Chinese room, he's a human inside the system who's duplicating the system's functions, and he's mimicking or enacting this program, this strong AI program, and he's able to understand a story allegedly, or be able to give responses and so on. Well, we'd certainly think the Chinese room had moral rights because Searle's in there. And I don't see any direct implication by the strong AI position that thing wouldn't have moral rights. Although somebody like Searle might say, well, it's lacking an internal light, or there's no sort of phenomenal consciousness that's going through. Lady Lovelace had famously objected to the Cartesian argument. In the 1800s, she argues that artificial entities might necessarily lack free will. Roger Penrose in 1999 and later has argued that artificial entities might necessarily be incapable of insight. I don't think I would give much credence to any of those positions. I'll say something about that in a second. Here's what Schwitzgebel and Garza say. Culturally, we've got a lot of culturally ingrained pictures in our heads of AIs as deterministic clockwork machines that, sort of serial deterministic functions. That is allegedly very different from us. We're spontaneous, unpredictable humans. And this picture we have of machines being that way makes it easier for us to imagine that they're lacking all of that and somehow they don't have moral rights. But Schwitzgebel and Garza say, but we see no reason to think that human cognition is any less mechanical or that we're more spontaneous than that of some possible machines. So surely whatever property it is you think we've got that's special, there's some possible machine that's coming soon that could have it, Searle notwithstanding. And we've seen, Schwitzgebel and Garza don't say this, but we've seen in our class that the properties of these new connectionist artificial neural networks are really quite remarkable, and they seem to undermine or undercut a lot of the classic sort of go-fi intuitions that people have about robots, about artificial intelligence systems. ANN systems are not clearly deterministic; they're stochastic. They don't seem to have a lot of the properties that lead to those to those intuitions that people have about there's something missing here, something it doesn't have. And I'm inclined to say, assert a premise like or a principle like this. Look, either feature X isn't morally or philosophically salient, or AIs appear to be able to have it, at least given where we're headed with some of the recent developments in computer science. So go back to that long list of possible objections that I listed on one of my Turing test slides, where people say, oh, well, it doesn't have this, it doesn't have that, it doesn't have that. Look, we're not going to be prejudicial against a machine simply because it's made of silicon. And if the other issues that we do think are relevant, like some freedom in some relevant sense, or some non-deterministic system in some relevant sense, well, clearly artificial neural networks have that, and they have it very much in they have it to some extent that resembles what we have in our neural networks. So I'm inclined to defend a principle like that last one, and then say that for most of these objections, either the objection doesn't single out something that's morally and philosophically salient that's defensible, or AIs, it looks like are going to have it soon enough. So these sorts of objections are going to fail. Again, that's my little addendum on top of their argument. Okay, so they consider another objection to this substitution argument. Someone might argue that AIs don't deserve equal moral concern because they don't have fragile, unique nature that can be so easily be harmed or destroyed. Like us, I mean, we're so ephemeral, we're fragile, we could easily be destroyed, and that's the crime or the shame of it. That's the loss, is when you have a unique human being and they and we lose that person in the world. But imagine with an AI that they could be duplicated, they could be backed up, perhaps without even knowing that they've been harmed or copied. So perhaps the idea behind the objection is that since an AI system can be copied, can be duplicated, can be replicated, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of times, that somehow undercuts or undermines their moral status, that they're not vulnerable, they're not susceptible to harm or damage because we can always just reiterate them. I got a couple of ideas about that. Schwitzgebel and Garza say, it's possible to create AIs that are unique and fragile, as unique and fragile as human beings, and if so, then this no relevant difference argument survives the objection. That's sort of their rejoinder to the whole thing. I don't really find that satisfying for a couple of reasons. Okay, so they just back up and say, well, then let's just build a unique and fragile AI, and then if it has the right kinds of moral-making properties in its psychological and social aspects, then it's got moral status. And I wish they'd push back further here. I think there's an argument to be made even stronger than they've made it. Look, if AI system 1 has rights, and suppose we copy it into AI 2, AI 3, AI 4, it seems to me that those all have rights too. How is being able to make copies of something reduce its rights? If we make copies of 1, why is it now that AI 3 has fewer rights than 1 does? If we kill him, it's a violation of his rights, right? The new copy is a new entity with his own rights. It doesn't strike me that killing a twin is any less bad than killing the other one. Or I've got an example here. Here's an Afghan hound that got cloned 3 times by scientists in a South Korean laboratory. So suppose the one on the left is the original dog, and then the other 2 are clones. So does the fact that the first dog is copyable, is duplicable, does that somehow undermine its rights? I mean, would we think it's okay to torture or kill the first one because we just made 2 more? I don't think so. I think you've got 3 dogs now that all have, to the extent that dogs have rights, I mean, we do think of them as having, in virtue of their sentience, we wouldn't want to inflict sort of heedless or reckless pain on them for no good reason. So you wouldn't think that the mere fact that those dogs have been cloned now means that one of them, the copies, is somehow less valuable, or that the original is less valuable in terms of rights than the first one. So I actually think Schwitzgebel and Garza should dig in harder here. But that's okay. I'm agreeing with them and just sort of fortifying their argument. Somebody might argue on some Hobbesian social contract theory where, war and conflict is the natural condition between all species or even within species. And, in virtue of a Hobbesian social contract argument, you might say, well, we owe nothing to alligators and they owe nothing to us. I don't expect an alligator to be well behaved towards me. I expect it to be hostile and aggressive. And it expects no less from me, I suppose. And we don't think that there's any, if somebody gets out of their car in a African safari park and a lion leaps on them and kills them, we don't think the person's rights have been violated, and we don't think that the lion has done them some moral harm. The lion's not a moral agent, and it's under no moral obligation to not behave that way. So somebody might think that some breakdown of that sort might insert in between humans and AI systems. So maybe would go the argument, we would owe even less moral consideration to aliens or to artificial intelligences. Now, this is in virtue of a Hobbesian social contract theory, so it is all going to depend on how you spell out the details of the social contract, right? This has been a sort of classic historical problem in the history of ethics, where people like Nozick or Rawls have asserted these scenarios whereby we say, well, we do have a social contract that binds certain kinds of entities implicitly. So what is it that creates that social contract, or what is it that gets you into membership into that contract, whereby now you get certain entitlements and certain rights and duties? Okay, so they acknowledge that this ignores or sets aside the psychological grounds for moral consideration. And then they say, look, straight up, this is kind of a flat rejection of a social contract theory. They say, look, torturing or killing a conscious, self-aware, intelligent being without a compelling reason is just morally odious or grossly wrong, whether you're in a social contract with them or not. So they're just making a sort of, brute appeal to intuition here that were aliens to show up and they were capable of feeling pleasure and pain, we would find someone's needlessly torturing them and inflicting suffering on them to be morally wrong, even in the absence of a social contract with them. Or perhaps you can unpack what you mean by a social contract theory to include that intuition and to build out what it is that puts someone into the contract. They maintain here that species membership is not a morally relevant difference. So maybe it's this, that whatever your social contract is, it ought not to stipulate senseless distinctions between species. That's not what matters. It's some other properties that entitle you to be included in the club. Okay, so somebody might make this objection. You might have heard one like this. Somebody might say, well, look, artificial intelligence, simply by virtue of being artificial, is made by us. It owes its existence to us, and thus can be terminated or subjugated at our pleasure without moral wrongdoing, as long as its existence has been overall worthwhile. That's an interesting proviso at the end. I'm not even sure if you need that, but somebody might say this. Imagine you've got a steer, let's suppose, leads a happy life grazing on lush hills. It wouldn't have existed at all if the rancher hadn't been planning to kill it for meat. Its death for meat is a condition of its existence. And overall, its life has been positive, seen as the package deal it is. The ranchers having brought it into existence and then killed it is morally acceptable. So sometimes people may make this kind of defense, give this sort of defense to eating meat. It's a kind of ownership or subjugation or existential debt. What they put as an existential debt justification. Here's what Schwitzgebel and Garza say in response. Imagine a couple has a child, and then after 8 happy years, the parents decide that they don't want to pay for more child-related expenses, so they can buy a boat. So they kill the child painlessly, right? So this is a reductio ad absurdum that's supposed to illustrate that the argument doesn't work. Look, if we bring into existence a genuinely conscious human-grade AI, fully capable of joy and suffering, with the full human range of theoretical and practical intelligence, and with expectations of future life. Okay, so there's a lot of conditions built in there. We make a moral decision approximately as significant and irrevocable as the decision to have a child. Okay, so we're talking about an AI system that's considerably more robust and significant than a mere steer in the previous example. And no one would ever countenance this argument that justifies killing a kid just because you own them, or you were causally responsible for them, or you brought them into this world, so now you therefore have some sort of right to take them out. Nobody thinks that that's true with regard to a human level system that has the right kinds of properties, so it's not going to work for an AI system either, say Schwitzgebel and Garza. This argument pushes the onus to the original decision to create. So what this means is, once you've created this thing, you can't just now violate its rights or do harm to it or ignore it. Ownership or causal responsibility of creation doesn't nullify its rights. So that means that the day you push the on button, if this is a system that's going to have those features, is the day that you create a being that has these obligations and these rights surrounding it. And now you're stuck. Right? So if you were going to make the decision to pull the plug, you make that beforehand, right? You can't take it back when you have a kid, when they're driving you crazy when they're 9, and you can't just kill this thing. I mean, there might be some conditions here. Go to Bostrom's super intelligent cases where we're worried about AIs destroying the human race. There might be some justification there, but there's a substantial burden of proof to overcome in order to make it morally acceptable now. Once you've pulled the plug and once you've pushed the button and started this thing and got it existing. Okay, so Schwitzgebel and Garza then actually go a step further. They say, look, it might even work out such that we owe more to artificial intelligence systems. So what we've been considering here is the possibility that we have fewer obligations to them, but they're suggesting that under the right circumstances, our moral obligations to them might expand or might be more rigorous or more substantial. I've called this an obligation of stewardship. This is not the word that they use, and I'm going to spin it a bit different than they do. But they make the point rightly, I think, that we would be in a position of complete godlike power over AIs. We would completely control their levels of happiness, their ability to experience happiness, their pain, their pleasure, and so on. We would have complete control over every aspect of their existence, and they would be exceedingly vulnerable to and helpless against our power. So that imbalance of power and that sort of godlike control over their existence now puts an extra burden on you, right? Because it would be gross and sort of morally reprehensible for you to, for instance, create a being that can only experience excruciating pain, and then you push the button and turn the thing on, right? So now you've just unilaterally expanded the amount of pain and suffering in the world for as long as that thing's on, right? So if you've got that capacity, if you've got that capability of inflicting that kind of existence on something that you're going to create, then that now puts some moral obligations on how you do it. Having this much asymmetrical power over another sentient being imposes greater obligations on you of restraint, good choices, and moral action. They say it would be morally odious to approach these design choices cavalierly with so much at stake. With great power comes great responsibility. Okay, so we might also owe them more because of their possible superiority, is a kind of rough way to put it. If it's possible to create a genuinely joyful experience in an AI, it will also likely be possible to create AIs who experience substantially more joy than the typical human being. So imagine the range of how much pleasure and pain a normal human being can feel. How bad can it get? How good can it get for them? Well, if we've got the capacity to build an AI system, and what if we can build it so that it can experience 100 times or 1,000 times more pleasure than what the typical human does? That creates an issue. Now, famously, Nozick had proposed this thing called a utility monster, which is a counterexample to try to modify a kind of utilitarian position. And Nozick's idea was, well, look, between you and me, when we're I'm going to imagine you're getting a pinprick on your hand and I'm getting a pinprick on my hand. Or imagine you get a lollipop and I get a lollipop, is the way that Nozick put this. And if it were the case, if his idea was a kind of really low-level, sort of simple-minded utilitarianism, if it were the case that our moral obligation is to maximize happiness or utility in the world, what if it turns out that because of your nervous system or because of the way you're built, that pinprick feels 100 times worse to you and that lollipop feels 100 times better to you? So that means now that when we make policy decisions or we make decisions about what are the morally right actions, then your considerations or your needs now outweigh mine by 100 to 1. And unless we can solve this problem of kind of equity between different agents, that creates a problem for utilitarianism. So now we've got the real possibility of building a system that can have these expanded capacities one way or another, and that creates this possibly creates this moral obligation here. If our moral obligation is to maximize happiness, as utilitarians have said, we might be obligated to create many such entities, even at a substantial cost to ordinary human beings. I mean, think about this, right? Suppose that we can set up a giant Tesla plant out in the middle of Nevada, and we can start cranking out hundreds of thousands of AI systems, and every one of them is capable of experiencing 1,000 times more joy in its existence than you are. So it wouldn't take us very long here to do the math and realize that we should be populating every available corner of the planet with them, and we don't need to have any humans around if we can help it, right? So depending on how you do the math and utilitarian accounts. So we might even be morally obligated to destroy ourselves, say Schwitzgebel and Garza, to create a network of bliss machines, right? That's a great line. Now, they're not suggesting that we actually are, but what they're pointing to is that, look, there's a whole bunch of problems to work out here. And you'll recall that when we did Stuart Russell's chapter 9, Russell, who thinks he's sort of solved the control problem and was imagining having these very powerful, super intelligent AI systems that were coupled to or connected to fulfilling human needs, Russell was wondering the same thing about on the human side. Okay, so now that we've got these massively powerful and effective systems in the world that could greatly increase the amount of pleasure and pain in the world, ours, or now we're realizing theirs, how do we distribute the resources and the energy and the work and make the decisions in order to do that in the optimal fashion? And that's what Schwitzgebel and Garza are kind of hinting at, is that there's a lot of problems here to be solved. We might owe them more due to their superiority. They point out that most philosophers reject these simple pleasure maximization approaches to ethics. And that was Nozick's point. The utility monster was supposed to be a reductio against that kind of simple-minded utilitarianism. Suppose we favor individual rights or rationality over pleasure, so we shift over to kind of more of a Millian-style utilitarianism or some other kind of moral view. Now we've got the same problem. Then an AI with superior rationality merits greater moral consideration. So their point They actually make this other really great example. They imagine a fission fusion monster case. So imagine an AI that can divide and merge at will into multiple rational agents, warranting greater concern for them than the humans that it now outnumbers. So imagine, a creature that multiplies on election day and votes tens of thousands of them, and then remerges back into a single entity with a single conscious history on the day after the election, and disproportionately affects the outcomes of the election or whatever happens, right? So whatever it is that we morally value, it would be rare stuff indeed if no hypothetical AI could possess more of it than a natural human. So whatever it is that's important here, in principle, it looks like we're going to be able to build AI systems that could have more of it. And that means we've got a problem in figuring out how to make our policy decisions and how to interact with them, what to do for them, what to not to do for them, what we owe them, and so on. This leaves us, to say the least, with some troubling puzzles for how to distribute moral concern. Okay, another problem. This has more to do with our interacting with AI systems. Evidence from developmental psychology suggests that human beings are much readier from infancy to attribute mental states to entities with eyes, movement patterns that look goal-directed, and contingent patterns of responsiveness than to attribute mentality to eyeless entities with inertial movement patterns and non-interactive responses. That is, if it looks and talks and behaves more like a mammal or like a human, then you're much more prepared, and it's much easier for you to think of it as having a mind. And if it doesn't act the right sorts of ways on the outside, then you're prone not to give it mental properties. And that's a problem for us because of course, such superficial features don't track underlying mentality very well in AI cases, like whether or not you've got moving eyes or whether or not you're waving like this little Honda robot is waving. Those are not morally or philosophically salient properties. But we're really bad judges because of the way that sort of behavior throws us off. So, we've got a set of intuitions that have developed under millions of years of evolution with very slow moving targets. And, we extend and sort of inadvertently, intuitively, automatically give special consideration to certain kinds of creatures. But now that's just not going to track anymore because of our ability to create is about pacing it. So they call this the ASIMO problem. And the problem is that this little robot from Honda is not AI. It's not an artificial intelligence of any significant sort. It's not sentient. It doesn't have autonomous rationality. I think it might even just be a remote control robot. So it doesn't have any of the psychological properties that are salient or relevant to being treated morally. Yet it's the way it's built like a little child. It's the way it acts, its behavior, all triggers those kinds of impulses in us. Okay, so the first lesson here, and is really graphic in this guy kicking the robot dog, is that in thinking about the moral status of AI systems, we should be careful not to overweight emotional reactions and intuitive judgments that might be driven by such superficial features. So I checked, and this Boston Dynamics robot is actually being driven off camera by a guy with a remote control, and that leg movement behavior where it rights itself after it gets pushed over is all sort of autonomous internal subroutines that it uses with gyroscope and with accelerometers to keep the thing upright. So that's all just mimicry behavior that is somewhat autonomous, but that's not accompanied by any pain. There's no nervous system. There's no sentience here. There's no higher functions. This is actually, it's state-of-the-art robotics for right now, but it doesn't have any of the psychological or social features that Schwitzgebel and Garza want to attribute to these. But the problem is that we can barely stand to watch that video because the guy looks like he's kicking a dog. So we get these false positive cases Our mirror neurons and our emotional systems, other aspects of human psychology, make us prone to overproject moral status onto stuffed animals, animal babies, cartoon characters, robots, and other false positive cases. And then there's false negative cases. We got to worry about those too. Ugly, boxy, or non-human seeming, but fully rational and sentient AIs might tend to attract less moral concern than they should, because our biological evolved intuitions are not tracking well on the moral properties. So we got both kinds of mistakes. So as a result, they come up with what they call some AI design advice. We should want people to neither over-attribute nor under-attribute moral status, so that's the false positive and false negative cases I was describing, to the entities with which they interact, when that misattribution jeopardizes the well-being or autonomy of an entity with legitimate moral consideration. So we've actually got to proceed with care here. We don't want anyone risking their life because they mistakenly believe they are protecting more than the mindless Furby before them, just like we don't want anyone neglecting their sim just because they don't realize it's a conscious creature with genuine feelings. Okay, so we need an emotional alignment design policy. Try to avoid designing entities that don't deserve moral consideration, but to which normal users are nonetheless inclined to give substantial moral consideration. And conversely, if we do someday create genuinely human-grade AIs who merit substantial moral concern, it would probably be good to design them so that they evoke the proper range of emotional responses from normal users, right? So this is going to be tricky, right? We need the outside behavior to evoke the right kinds of appropriate moral impulses in us, in our intuitions, that will reflect the right sorts of philosophical properties that the things possess. And I dug up an article here. There's actually been a study where, in this case, it's actually kind of twisted. They have this little robot, this cute little robot that sits on a desk, and they recruited a bunch of volunteers, and they had this robot act different ways. In one set of subjects, the little robot acted very human and mimicked human behavior. And in other cases, it would act more like a robot, very functional and very robotic. And then in some cases, it would beg not to be turned off. And in other cases, it would just be silent. Not surprisingly, humans in the trial struggled with the human-like begging robot when they had to turn it off. They had the hardest time to have this little robot pleading with them not to shut it off after they'd had this sort of human-like exchange with it, right? So it's really putting a clear emphasis on this confusion problem that Schwitzgebel and Garza are talking about. Okay, last point. Things are going to get weirder still. There could be AIs with behavior that splits the experts on whether they are conscious or sentient, etc. Imagine that they get, even if that robot dog, that Boston Dynamics dog is that confusing, imagine how confusing even, professional philosophers of mind are going to be when they're looking at these things in 20 or 30 years. So there's a very high risk here that if the disbelievers wrongly win, then we might perpetuate the moral equivalent of slavery and murder without realizing we're doing so. If the believers wrongly win, the first was the disbelievers, sorry. If the believers wrongly win, we might sacrifice real human interests for the sake of artificial entities who don't have interests worth the sacrifice. I mean, imagine, we're having this conflict now with some people in society who are similarly protesting about the subjugation of animals and factory farming and the use of animals for food. And there's not... Well, I won't say there's no high risk there, but imagine taking the dynamics of that question and amplifying it up to this much larger scale and much higher risk. So developing a good theory of consciousness here about what it takes to have the right kinds of psychological properties is really a moral imperative. So they suggest that we have an excluded middle policy. We should only be creating AIs whose moral status is clear one way or another. It's either something that goes below, that its actual properties are below the moral threshold so that our behavior won't, and its behavior also doesn't provoke us to treat it wrong or treat it as if it has moral status. Or if it has the right sorts of psychological properties, then we ought to have it behave in ways that invoke the right kinds of attitudes from us, and nothing in between. We shouldn't have these in between ambiguous cases because the risks are so great. So there are ideas that the weirder these minds get, the more it's going to destabilize human intuitions about ethics. Our intuitive, evolved ethical impulses were shaped in a context in which the only species capable of human-grade, practical, and theoretical reasoning was humanity itself, and in which human variation tended to stay within certain boundaries. So we were safe. We had millions of years to develop a bunch of moral intuitions about humans, and those all sort of track fairly well on the right kinds of moral properties. But now that's all threatening to get disrupted. Our ethics systems are ill-prepared for utility monsters, fission-fusion monsters, AIs of vastly superior intelligence, highly intelligent AIs nonetheless designed to be cheerfully suicidal slaves, toys with features designed specifically to capture children's affection. We've talked about the movie Her a few times in this class so far. Giant virtual sim worlds that can be instantiated on a home computer, or entities with radically different value systems. Like, we're just not ready for all of that, yet it's coming given the technological developments. We might expect human moral judgment to be baffled by such cases and to deliver wrong or contradictory or unstable verdicts in those kinds of cases. And, they've made it very clear in what ways. Okay, so the argument has been that there are possible AIs with no morally relevant differences to us. Therefore, they deserve moral consideration similar to us. We would likely even have more moral obligations to them than to, say, human strangers, like a parent would or a god. And then they make a few recommendations. We should design AIs that tend to provoke reactions from users that accurately reflect the AI's real moral status. And we should avoid designing AIs whose moral status is unclear. And furthermore, AIs with weird configurations are certainly going to disrupt our moral intuitions and theories.